Welcome once again to Sid Cordell and Christian People's Alliance, indeed. Rishi has had a bad week. He's devastated, according to some informants. The election results, obviously, which were expected. But if you drill down into this, Sid, you come up with perhaps, or are they desperate, the Tories, to get some good out of bad? But the rudderless ship comes to mind. It ain't the Tory party. It's not been the Tory party for 13, 14 years. He's going to get thrown out. And it's all down to who votes for reform.
Not entirely, but yeah. But I mean, obviously the results are very disappointing for the Conservative Party. And they will be hoping now that in an election year that they would be improving. And they would at very least have been looking for signs that their vote was beginning to rise, when in fact these by-elections show a very similar picture to the other two. Although, interestingly enough, as with the last by-elections which we had, it doesn't show any picture of Conservative voters going out and voting Labour. In Wellingborough, Labour got 13,844 votes. In the general election, they got 13,769. So it was virtually the same vote. But the turnout, of course, was way down, from 65% down to 38%. So the Labour voters came out and voted. The Conservative voters didn't. A few voted Reform, but I mean, we're only talking about 3,000 votes that Reform got. So it's by no means the large numbers of Conservative voters voting Reform. There's a few that voted Reform, that's all. And in Kingswood, it's even worse for Labour, funnily enough. I mean, in the general election, they got over 16,000 votes. And in the by-election, they got just over 11,000, 11,176 against 16,479. I mean, it's like, so that their vote actually went down by 5,000 compared with the general election. So, but the turnout was even worse. It's down from 73%, I believe, to 31%. I mean, it's literally a very low turnout. But there is hope there for the Conservatives in the sense that all these voters that aren't voting in the by-elections, because they're disillusioned, presumably, are likely to come out and vote in a general election, when the choice isn't going to be, do you approve of the government, yes or no, which basically is the choice in a by-election. It'll be, who do you want to run the country, Labour or Conservative? And there aren't signs, frankly, that Keir Starmer is very popular and people can't wait to elect Keir Starmer. The media would like to think so. I mean, you know, the BBC and Sky News and all these would like to think that Keir Starmer is incredibly popular and people are longing for a Starmer government. But that's not reality. The reality is that people are pretty disillusioned with all the politicians, and they certainly don't want the Conservatives to stay in power, but I'm not by no means clear that they want Labour to come in either.
Well, it's going to be interesting. We're not going to be falling asleep during that night, certainly. But it just shows the paucity of the political system. Yes, it's not PR. There's pros and cons about that. If it was PR, this next election would make more sense. And probably we'd get the right government. As it is at the moment, first past the post, we're going to be stuck with the same boring people, Sid.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there's obviously going to be a big turnover in MPs. I mean, there's the last count, I believe there's 58 Conservative MPs have said that they're not restanding. And obviously there'll be a fair number that will lose their seats. And so there'll be a lot of new people coming into Parliament. But in terms of the parties, then if because of the voting system, like you say, it's going to be either Conservative or Labour. And the numbers of extras are going to be relatively few. Now, it's interesting because, I mean, if we had a proportional representation system, then obviously we'd have a lot more parties in power because people could feel free to vote for smaller parties, including the Christian People's Alliance, on the grounds that, well, you know, if you get 5% of the vote or whatever, they can get some people in parliament. Well, in Israel, it's only 3% of the vote or 2.5% of the vote. It's you can get MPs in parliament. Getting that sort of percentage is not that difficult. So come on, let's get behind this party. Let's have them at least represented in parliament. So then you have negotiations for some sort of coalition agreement, but at least it means that the main party that wins the most seats doesn't just implement their agenda without any consideration of what other people might think. I think it is a good thing, actually, if you have a coalition of parties working together, which are listening to each other, are forced to listen to each other and consider each other's policies. I think it actually makes for good government.
Well, we're going to have a fascinating time. One thing that is getting definitely boring is the christening of left and right. Now, if you are to the right of the Tory party, then you're extreme right. If you're one of Keir Starmer's lot and are left of centre, you're not extreme left, you're just left. This is a psychological warfare that's been carried on for years, Sid. Have people seen through it, or are they still beguiled?
Well, it depends where people stand who are doing the talking. I mean, if you're a Labour supporter or you're on the left, then you look at the Conservative Party and you see them as far right. And you look upon somebody like, Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, and you see him as centre left or something. But if you stand on the Conservative side, you look at Keir Starmer and you see somebody on the left. You look at Jeremy Corbyn and you say he's hard left or extreme left. And you look upon the Conservative Party itself and you say, well, they'd be centre right. So it really just depends where you're standing. And the reason why the BBC, for instance, and Sky News and ITN and all these organisations that sit on the left and give news on the left, the reason why they look at people like Reform and say, oh, they're extreme right, is because they sit so far on the left themselves. That's why they're so far away.
Indeed. Let's move over, first of all, before we go to the States, to Russia. Putin has once again intervened in affairs. Now, Navalny's death, there's all sorts of news coming out. Oh, he's full of bruises. He got the same umbrella treatment as the poor souls that came to England. The man is not manageable. He's not a nice bunny, Sid. And we're threatening with all sorts of things, but we're doing nothing.
Well, it's very, very difficult. I mean, the first thing we should say is we do know that Russia tries to kill their political enemies. Yes, because we had a situation in the UK where Russia tried to kill Sergei and Yulia Skripal. And we know that it was Novichok poisoning that was used because some unfortunate lady who was happened to be passing by saw what she thought was a bottle of perfume that had been left by the road and decided to pick it up and spray herself with it, and she ended up dead. She ended up massively dead. And they traced it to the substance that was used to attack Sergei Skripal. Now, he didn't die, fortunately, but it was a touch and go. Now, Navalny was also attacked with the same substance. We know that because he fled to Germany to get treatment. He got treated in a German hospital and lived. And then he went back to Russia. He was advised not to go back to Russia because obviously his life was in danger. But he said, no, I am Russian and Russia's where I belong. So with great courage, he went back to Russia. In 2021, he was then taken to court and charged with trumped up charges, frankly. There was nothing, he'd done nothing wrong, but he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and that's communism for you. That's what they do to dissidents. But the fact that he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, carted off to Siberia to go and serve his sentence for 30 years, and then ends up dead. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting. disgusting, frankly. But this is what they've done to Christians, though, over and over again. Numerous Christians have just been treated like this, sentenced to decades in prison simply for leading churches. And it's like, leading people in Bible study and prayer, decades in prison, because you're then an enemy of the state. Simply because Marx said that religion is the opiate of the people, so we're Marxists and we can't tolerate religion. And and it's evil. But what's going to happen now? We'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's just incredible that they've had hundreds of people laying tributes to Navalny, and the people laying tributes are arrested and put in prison for laying tributes to him. And thugs are coming along and ripping down all the tributes and throwing away all the flowers. And people come again with more flowers. Russia is now a horrible, horrible state under Putin, a horrible state, an evil state. And frankly, it must be. It cannot last. It's got to be overthrown. And I think what he's done to Navalny may well be a seed that leads to Putin's demise, frankly.
Well, it'll have to come from inside. It won't be done from outside, Sid. But there appears to be nobody on the scene anymore. He was the last of the brave.
Well, his widow is now, she's been to Brussels. She's been going all over the place, calling for support, calling for sanctions on Putin, goodness knows what else. I mean, yes, it will have to come from inside. You're quite right. I mean, Biden notoriously said when Putin invaded Ukraine, we can't take on Russia. They've got nuclear weapons. I mean, so the fact is that he's now complaining like crazy because Congress won't give Ukraine more weapons. But he said we can't use American weapons because we're frightened. I mean, it's just, he's frankly got no credibility, that man, none at all. But the international community have got to see Putin now as a pariah, as an outcast, and hopefully China will do as well, because up to now, China and Iran and North Korea have been the countries that have supported Russia. But those countries should, take note and stop supporting Putin. Really, they should.
Okay, let's go to another trumped-up charge, literally. They've got him in New York, the Donald. How dare you say your house is worth £350 million? Well, frankly, one day it might be. Yesterday it was. Who knows? You can ask what you want. Still a free world in some instances. He's valued it as that. So what's the big deal? Well, we know what the big deal is. They're out to get him because New York is the famous, well, left of centre Democrat Party. And wherever he goes, he gets trumped up charges against him. They're getting desperate, aren't they?
Well, the ruling by Judge Erdogan doesn't make a modicum of sense, frankly, because he said Mar-a-Lago was only worth 18 million. He had a realtor, which is what estate agents are called in America. They call them realtors. And the realtor came and gave evidence in court. He would love to put Mar-a-Lago on the market, and he reckons he could get around about 1.2 billion for it if he was to put it on the market. Now, Trump, when he took his loan out on Mar-a-Lago, valued it at about 450 million, or maybe something like the price that you said. But Erdogan, when he gave his judgment, said, you valued this property at between 1 and 1.5 billion, which is frankly ridiculous. It's far too high. Well, he didn't, not for the loan. For the loan, he didn't value it at that price. That was what the realtor said he thought he could get. So that's dishonest, frankly. But then he says he thinks it's only worth 80 million, which is just absolutely ludicrous. I mean, Trump quite rightly said, okay, well, if it's worth 80 million, I'll have 10. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, but if it is only worth 18 million, how can he afford a 355 million fine? I mean, I thought all the properties are massively overvalued. But the thing is, Trump has repaid all the loans that he took. And he even had the lenders saying, yes, he was a very good customer, we got no problem. There's no victim. Elon Musk has said, okay, well, who is the victim? If this payout of 355 million, who's going to get the money? I mean, because no one's been defrauded. So somehow is the state going to get the money? But why should the state get the money? The state hasn't been defrauded. I mean, if there's been somebody, I mean, if there was a lender, the lender here is Deutsche Bank, by the way. But if Deutsche Bank was going to taking Trump to court and saying, you know, we gave you a loan of 500 million and you've repaid 150 million and you owe us 350 million, and, you know, and your properties were massively overvalued. So when we came to sell your properties because you hadn't repaid the loan, the money wasn't there. So you now owe us 250 million. And the judge had said, yeah, you're right, Trump, you owe Deutsche Bank 250 million. You know, bang, go, you know, you've got to pay it. You know, you would have said, well, sorry, he didn't repay the loan, did he? You know, he borrowed the money. It was his fault. He owes the money. But in this situation, all the money is repaid. He doesn't owe anything. The bank's happy. You know, it's ludicrous. And what's happened today is, I say today because they've actually started the protest today, is that truckers in America are refusing to take goods to New York because of this judgment. So there's a boycott of New York going on right now. And they reckon it could swell to literally hundreds and hundreds of truckers that are literally refusing to go to New York. They reckon that 95% of the truckers support Trump. So they're putting great big signs on their lorries saying, you know, they're standing for Trump, refusing to go to New York. And we'll have to wait and see what happens. I mean, the fake news media won't be reporting this. I mean, you know, they won't be telling everyone that all the lorry drivers are demonstrating, but they're basically saying, look, what you've done in New York to our president is just disgusting. And we're not taking goods to your city until this is overturned. I mean, that's going to make people think, isn't it? I'd like to think it'll make people think.
Well, I see the newspaper reports, and certainly the television side is practically 100% Democrat. But it doesn't stop the march of the Trump. He's never been so far ahead. He's definitely favourite, unless he does something really stupid towards the end.
Well, you see, people have a very strong sense of justice. And, you know, in this situation, whatever you say, I mean, it's impossible to say, oh, Trump deserves to be fined 255 million. I mean, literally impossible. I mean, you have to be a hard left socialist or Trump hater to, you know, but even then, how do you justify it? Because there is no justification. And in this sort of situation, when somebody is obviously being persecuted, in America, they're calling it lawfare, which is a bit something like warfare, I suppose, but they call it lawfare. The law is being used against somebody, and people think that isn't right. It's not fair. So the more they attack Trump like this, the more people are going to say it's not fair, it's not right, and the more people are going to get behind it, and he's going to get more votes. It's expected, frankly.
Right, we're going back to the UK. We're going to discuss dentists. We alluded to them last week. They've been bribed £20,000 to work on a Saturday, basically. And now it's emerged that they are not going to check overseas qualifications, unless it's within the EU, of dentists, because we're that desperate to get them. So any plumber, carpenter, electrician can come in and open your mouth. Let's see what I can do. You couldn't write the script.
Well, so I don't think that's fair. I mean, I think what they're saying is people have still got to produce the qualifications. But what they're saying is that they're not going to, for instance, if somebody comes from India and says, I'm a qualified dentist, here's my qualification, they're not going to go back to India and check with the organisation that they got the qualifications through that this is genuine and the guy is indeed on the list. I mean, if the guy turns out to be a joiner or a carpenter, then I imagine as soon as the first person opens their mouth, they're going to have a bit of a problem being a successful dentist, aren't they? I mean, but it is still concerning because if somebody's, got qualifications from India as a dentist, I mean, how good are they? We don't know. But I should say, by the way, that I wanted to do a course at an American university, and for that they required my it was an MA course, and for that they required my Bachelor of Arts certificate, which was fair enough. So I gave them my Bachelor of Arts certificate, and they said, "Oh, we've got to have this verified. It's got to be verified by the university." Well, we're talking about 1977, so of course then nothing was on computer. So they had to go back to the archives of the university to try and to try and verify this document. And in the end, it just didn't happen. So I never did the course. But I think, frankly, having to verify every document is not a straightforward process. And I don't blame the authorities if they say we're not going to bother with verification anymore. But I presume that the people that they take on board, that at least do some straightforward tests to make sure that they're competent.
It gets from bad to worse. John Lewis certainly does. The number of woke companies both sides of the Atlantic has gone exponential, although there are signs that it's bouncing back in America because they've just stood back, hooray, we haven't in the UK, and said, look at the profit, look at the balance sheet last year, because you've gone woke. And John Lewis is a prime example. It's getting rid of 11,000 jobs. We don't need the jobs anymore. Well, not surprised the way it's going. This is their in-house magazine that they've got. And it goes to all the workers, of course. And they are so woke, they've got 4 holidays coming up shortly, or celebrations. The first one being International Non-Binary People Day, then followed by a Sexual Awareness Week, and then a Trans Day Remembrance Day. Well, the best one I like, of course, is the Pansexual and Pan-Romantic Visibility Day. I mean,
God help us.
What do you do with them?
Well, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? But one thing that business is hopefully beginning to learn is that the more that they engage in this wokery, the more they lose business and their profitability goes down. I mean, it's happening again and again, and particularly with notorious examples like Bud Light and Disney. I mean, their profits are going down. They're absolutely nosediving. And if companies if happy for their profits to go down or happy to do less business, good luck to them. But they're going to have to know. They're going to have to know. There's a penalty to pay for this sort of garbage.
Right, and it gets worse, of course, because it gets dangerous. Because this magazine is purporting to support mermaids. Now, even the NHS, and there's woke for you, are not happy with mermaids. They're into all sorts of drugs, mermaids, to change your sex. And also, of course, they're suggesting breast binding so that the young ladies cannot grow. And they're showing and promoting this. Said it's truly awful.
Well, it's terrible. And mermaids were actually banned from schools. But of course, even though they were banned from schools, individual schools could still, individual woke head teachers could still say, oh, well, we want mermaids to come into our school, or they'll bring them in without even telling anybody who they are. So they'll probably change the name or give them another name. But if people don't know, mermaids are the main transsexual organisation in the UK. But everything is targeted at children. So you see what you're talking about, breast binding is all targeted at teenagers. So we're going to stop teenagers developing breasts so that they can appear as males. I mean, it's just, frankly, it's evil. I mean, there's no other word for it, I'm afraid.
Well, is this worse? We're fun and games today, aren't we? There's a young lady called Carmen Smith, or Lady Smith. South African connotations there. She's 27, and she's to be a lord or a lady. She's been voted to the House of the Lords because of our peculiar system now about the House of Lords. My goodness, does it need reforming? You've still got actually a basis of 70 odd, as I understand. People are hereditaries. And there was a standard when it was all hereditary. Not very democratic, but at least there was a standard there. Now, anybody can get in there, it seems. This young lady has been put in there because she's Plaid Cymru, and you've got to have a representative. And Dafydd Wigley is now 80, and she seemed to take over, but take over is perhaps the wrong phrase, because the party, the local party, had a vote, and by 170 they voted for a fella as opposed to 50 voting for her, and yet she gets the ladyship because she's a woman, of course. So everybody's on a quota these days, even Plaid Cymru. It's a nonsense. She is going to get £340 a day just for turning up. That's about a couple of £1 million if she sticks with it. And what's she going to say? What experience has she got? Following the announcement, I was listening to an early morning programme, and BBC, who else, were saying how brilliant this was. And she was saying, oh, yes, I support the Palestinians, the usual thing the left vote for. And she says, I might do the job for 5 years and then I'll do something else. Now, my goodness me, where are we, Sid?
Well, yes, that's a very strange statement. So, first of all, perhaps we should just explain how the system works. So, the number of lords appointed according to the number of seats which each party has in the House of Commons. So, Plaid Cymru has 3 seats in the House of Commons, so they'll only have a right to appoint a lord or lady probably once every 3 or 4 years. And the DUP they've got 8 MPs, so they've had a couple of people that they've appointed to the House of Lords. So that's the way the system works. Now, it's then up to the party that's given that seat to appoint whoever they want to the House of Lords. And there's nobody that says, I'm sorry, you can't appoint this person. I would imagine that Plaid Cymru have appointed this lady because they think, well, if we appoint somebody aged 27 to be a life peer, then she'll be able to stay in the House of Lords probably for 50 years. And so we'll have somebody in the House of Lords for 50 years, and we then get a right to appoint somebody else. That'll be somebody else on top of her. And her seat won't be lost. If she only stays for 5 years, that'll totally undermine the whole purpose of appointing her in the first place, because the purpose of appointing her was so that she'd be there for many years to come. I've been in the House of Lords and listened to some of the debates, and it's a very unforgiving place. And I think, frankly, that she'll really struggle, because if she says something that's out of place, they will destroy her, and they'll make fun of her, but they'll do it in a very, how can I put it, subtle way. I mean, they'll say, and the lady has said, but I'm afraid she is ill-informed. They'll talk in very colourful language, and they'll just put her down so that she feels about 2 foot tall, frankly. And I think she'll hate it, because unless she's very, very clever and able to be well researched and on everything that she talks about, they will destroy her.
Plaid Cymru clever because, of course, it's a party political position that they want to get rid of the Lords if they ever get into power. The Lords go, that's the first thing we'll get rid of. It's bizarre.
What I was going to say, by the way, is what you said about Plaid Cymru actually supporting the Palestinian cause, which I find this very interesting, because when they had a vote in the House of Commons last time, I mean, it may be different next time, but the Labour Party abstained. The Conservative Party was very much against a ceasefire, supporting Israel. The SNP were totally in favour of a ceasefire. Plaid Cymru were totally in favour of a ceasefire. And you think, so it's interesting that these nationalists apparently have positioned themselves to the left of the Labour Party, but also the Lib Dems and the Greens were also in favour of immediate ceasefire. So they're also positioning themselves to the left of the Labour Party. So it's very interesting, frankly. I mean, because, you know, particularly in November, I mean, obviously a lot has happened since November, but in November, we're just talking about within a month or so of the horrific killings on October the 7th. To then be telling Israel you can't defend yourself was wrong in a big way.
Yeah, don't forget, Mr. Flip Flop has now said at the Scottish Socialist Conference that he now wants to see a ceasefire. That's about the third one in a week. If the Tories made one U-turn in a month, it's a disaster, but 3 in a week, and yet they still win the by-elections. Yeah, something's going on, Sid. But let's move on to doom and gloom again, and we'll quote what some commentators are calling the doom spiral. And it's about the dear old C of E. I'll give you some stats. C of E has diminished by 20% since just before COVID. They've not gone back to church. The number of parishioners has gone down that much. Closing rate in the last 5 years of parishes, 300. That's a lot. Of course, the hierarchy in the CBS saying, oh, it's COVID. They've not returned because they need to get used to it. Really? Doesn't say much for their brand of Christianity, I don't think. Perhaps it gets worse when I say 641 church closures since the year 2000. There's the odd honest, I'm sure they're not odd, or perhaps they are. In the Church of England, the Rector of London has sent and summed the whole thing up. The churches have the money to do something about this, but they don't have the will. Is that true?
Oh, that's a very interesting statement. Well, what's going on in these churches is that they're moving away from biblical teaching and moving increasingly to an atheist way of thinking, which is basically our morals are what we think is right, not on what the Bible says is right, because obviously atheists have got no moral standard. So all atheist morals are subjective and not objective. And in the church, when we abandon the teaching of Jesus and we say we're not following that anymore, we're going to do what we think is better, then we're basically on the same plane as atheists. And this is what's happening now with blessing same-sex marriage, or in the Methodist Church actually holding same-sex marriages. See, the Methodist Church has gone down enormously in numbers. It is right to an extent to blame COVID, but what's happened with COVID is that people increasingly can go online. But you see, when you go online, you can choose whichever church you want to go online to for the comfort of your own home. You don't have to go to your local church, which might be quite boring. You can look around at lots of different church services that are there online and choose the one that's the most exciting and lock into that one. And you think, yeah, I love this, and believe you me, any church that supports same-sex marriage will not experience the power of God in the church. And by that, I mean, people will not get healed in the name of Jesus. They will not see miracles in the church. They will not see signs and wonders, which is, we're talking about God. And when we talk about God, we expect God to be doing things in the church. I mean, one guy said, I think famously, which I love, if God doesn't show up at church, why should I? We expect God to show up at church and do things. And that's the sort of church which I want to go to. Now, churches supporting same-sex marriage aren't going to see that. They're going to see any of that. So what are they doing? They're just going to be a social club. And if people, if they're just a social club, then why should there be any will to expand or increase or whatever? If people want to go to the club, let them go to the club. If they don't want to, if they prefer to stay at home, let them stay at home. I mean, there's no spiritual reason to go to church once you abandon the teaching of Jesus. That's the reality of it.
Interesting stuff. I'll tell you, I've got some more interesting stuff. Bet you've not heard this one, Sid. Do you know what CBAM is? C,
No.
as in C, cat, BAM, B-A-M. Well, apparently,
I know about this.
Yeah, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That's what that stands for. And it's come from the EU. Could they be getting the odd thing right? Apparently, by the year 2026, 2027 for the UK, there's going to be taxes at the border, and it's going to get at the people, India, China, etc., that couldn't care less about net zero or any net. And from that date, they will be required to pay a tax which will be related to their carbon footprint. Is it a good idea? I can't see it working, but is it a good idea?
Well, it's interesting, but of course the reality is that the carbon that comes from the UK is less than 1% of the total carbon from the world. So we can reduce our carbon footprint to nil, and it will have less than 1% effect on the total output from the whole world. So, but you see, but the reason of of what I've just said, the logic of what I've just said, is that we've got to work as a one world government. We can't work as individual nations. And when it comes to carbon footprint, working as individual nations is an utter waste of time. So, of course, we've got to look at the nations that are most polluting. And the most polluting nations are India and China. So, of course, we've got to say, how can we reduce pollution from India and China? If they won't do it themselves, and we'll have to tax them, which is, from their perspective, makes sense. I mean, from my perspective, I think there's greater priorities. Frankly, I'm by no means convinced that that man-made carbon emissions are causing all the problems that they say that they're causing. I'm not convinced. I'm a skeptic on that, I'm afraid. But what I do know is that God created the world. The world is in the hands of God, and it will finish when God declares. And I also know that carbon is a good thing in nature and required in nature as part of life. I mean, without carbon, we don't have life. So it's certainly not entirely a bad thing to have carbon in nature. So and when they talk about this 1.5%, oh, we've had 1.5% growth. You think it was 1.5% growth this year, the way they talk. It's actually 1.5% growth from the year 1800. So we're talking about 1.5% over 200 years. And the way they're talking, you'd think we've got this climate emergency and the carbon emissions are rising exponentially, and unless we do something immediately within the next 4 or 5 years, it's going to be a disaster. And actually, it's just totally untrue. But they're using it to create a need for a one world government. That's what they're doing.
Yeah, the facts are not stacking up. The true facts are coming out, Sid. Even this week, figures and NASA figures who are very pro the global warming are now changing their mind. It depends what data you take and what date you take to compare things. But much the bigger influence is the position of the sun, or the Earth rather, around the sun, to be more accurate, and how that affects the climate change. A lot of it's a nonsense. One thing is very important, according to everybody, perhaps everybody agrees with this, that parts per million of CO2, which is what we are looking at here, well, it used to be 300, it's now 400. Panic, panic, panic. Can I tell you that if you are a horticulturist growing things, what you put in your greenhouses is at least 1,200 per million, and it would not affect the atmosphere if the whole world was that. In fact, the Sahara Desert might get greener than it's growing at the moment. So all this is nonsense, but what is not nonsense is that 300 is perhaps far too low. You get below 200 and we're all dead because photosynthesis doesn't work. But you don't hear these facts. It's all the new religion. But let's cheer people up and say Royal Mail. It's been announced over the last few weeks, actually, that we've, bless them, lost £650 million last year. The accounts were awful. It's not surprising because the internet's destroyed many businesses. First one to fall, anybody could see, would be the post office. People would soon send letters by email instantaneously. Why wait and pay a fortune putting a stamp on an envelope? So the answer, according to some of the union, is a 3-work-day week. Interesting. 4 days they might get, 5 days it's difficult, Sid. They want extra payments for any extra days, and that actually will save them 600 and odd million. I can't see it, but I can see the problems that are facing Royal Mail.
Yeah, this was always going to be a problem for Royal Mail, but the right approach is to expand into new areas, because they're a very large organisation. They're a large communication organisation. There's lots of new organisations like DHL and TNT that are doing parcel delivery. I mean, very efficiently and effectively. Amazon are increasingly, doing an enormous amount of parcel delivery. People buying online, everything has to be delivered to the door when you buy online. There's still, letter delivery, like you say, is in serious decline. So the post office have got to get into the parcel delivery business in a lot more efficiently and effectively. It's there, it's out there, and get the business. And they've got to be more diversify into whole new areas. The right approach, frankly, isn't just to say we're going to start laying our staff off. The right approach is to say we've got to move into new areas and operate more efficiently. It does make sense in this new world where people are engaging electronically much more to say that we're only going to deliver letters maybe 3 times a week. We're not going to deliver letters 6 or 7 days a week anymore, because people don't need, there's so much now that goes electronically. And, if something is being sent by post, like a birthday card or Christmas card, it doesn't have to be delivered the next day. So I think this next day delivery has got to change to, 2-day delivery, and they've got to operate on that basis.
Tim Stanley of the Telegraph has written this very day an important article about the nation, because he's given up on things, and he said the following. It's not in specific Christian terms, but there again it is. And he's identified that what is wrong with the nation is that we have a spiritual crisis. And that means we have a society now without any motivating spirit. What does he mean? Well, Christianity, C of E facts that we gave earlier on, certainly since 1970, has really gone down the proverbial pan gradually, and it's maintained its increase as it's gone down the hill. We don't do family anymore, he says. We do individual. And I think that's very insightful. I think he's absolutely right. We now have jobs that aren't real. What does he mean by that? Well, it means HR jobs and people collecting data, perhaps, and many other jobs that are not real. If you get as we mentioned earlier, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, etc., you can see, people working in the NHS, they work hard, they're seen to work hard, and they produce results. but a large part of society is not producing anything. And frankly, perhaps it's not needed. The other thing is there's 2.5 million people on stickies. We don't want to work. And because the social security system in Britain is so generous, some people will say stupid, they can get away with it. But I tell you the biggest thing that people are getting away with in Britain, something that the academics, they're good for some things, bless them, have identified in society, and it's called quiet quitting. Now, remember that phrase. I think it's important. Quiet quitting. It means if you're in a job, you've seen the political and maybe spiritual insight of the country as not being an answer for you. They shrug their shoulders, and instead of putting in a 5-day week, they probably put in a 3-day week. They work slower, and they've got no motivation, no aim. So I'll get my pension, I'll carry on. A lot of truth there, Sid.
Yes, you see, unfortunately, in this day and age, patriotism is almost like a dirty word. And, you know, if you fly the British flag, you're far right. So patriotism and, you know, love for the country is something which is largely gone by the board. Children in school are being told that your parents' values are wrong. Don't listen to your parents, listen to us. And that's extremely unhelpful. So children are basically growing up and being taught in school to despise their parents, which doesn't help for family values. Obviously, divorce is very much on the increase. I mean, for many, many years, divorce was really quite difficult, and anyone that was threatened with divorce could appeal against it and say, you know, no, I want my value my marriage. I don't want to be divorced, and you know, and the courts could say, okay, well, you know, let's go back and try and sort it out. Nowadays, it's like no fault divorce, which has only been introduced by this government, literally in the last 2 or 3 years. No fault divorce. So all of a sudden now you can go to court and say, I want to be divorced, and the court will say, yeah, okay, you can be divorced. You know, we're where the Quran says, you know, a man wants to divorce his wife, he just says 3 times, I divorce you, and you're divorced. That's all. I mean, there's no sense of responsibility, capability. Why do you need to be divorced? That's all out the window. It's just, you know, you want to be divorced and that's it. And it's one party, it doesn't have to be 2 parties. One party says, I want to be divorced, and the marriage is dissolved. And that's terrible for the family, it's terrible for the children, and it's terrible for the whole of society. And until we get back to really valuing marriage and the family and valuing what we are, then our society will suffer.
Sid, I've challenged you today. We've covered some unusual topics, but I hope it's been helpful. And certainly you've got Christian in the title of your party. And after all, it does matter. Well, that's great. We'll see you next week.
Yes. God bless you.